Good evening to everybody. I'm pleased to welcome all those who are present tonight, and especially Professor Francois Hartog, our invited speaker. As you all may know, this initiative is part of a lecture series we decided to call a few years ago, Voices from Contemporary Philosophy. The series, which has now come to its third year, has seen in the last 2 years prominent scholars working in different fields of philosophy give a public talk on a topic of their choice. We had the opportunity to host major figures in the contemporary philosophical arena, such as Charles Taylor, Axel Honneth, Ruth Hagen-Gruber, Romain Desandre, Achille Varzi, Wendy Brown, Vittorio Oesle, Leila Gandhi, and others. This year's program, besides Francois Hartog, includes Alessandro Pinzani, who spoke in March, Adriana Cavarero, Jane Bennett, and Max Kistler. As is clear from this list, the goal of this initiative is to get a sense of the major trends in the various areas of contemporary philosophy by hearing from those who are currently conducting cutting-edge research in these fields. Francois Hartog is a historian. He has produced important studies on ancient history. However, those who have had the opportunity and pleasure of reading his books, essays, and articles know that what he has written has strong philosophical interest and relevance. I'm thinking particularly, but not only, of his research on the Christian concept of time, on regimes of historicity, on presentism, on memory and heritage, on anthropology, and on various issues of philosophy of history. In short, is a leading voice in the current philosophical debate. For this reason, we are glad that he has accepted our invitation to deliver a lecture within this lecture series, and we are eager to hear from him tonight. Now I will leave the floor to Professor Giangiulio for an appropriate introduction of our guest.
Not an appropriate introduction, but just a few words again about François Hartog. Well, François Hartog is one of the most inspiring intellectuals in Europe now. For decades, he has been engaged in a process of reflection that's as complex and wide-ranging as it is coherent in terms of method and content. In short, one could say that his main research topics are the Greeks within European culture, otherness, time, history, memory, and humanism. A former pupil of the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, he took his agrégation in history, was university professor, director of the Centre Louis Gernet, and directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. And now he is emeritus there. I dare say that a crucial part of his intellectual development were both a year-long trip around the world in the early 1970s, just after his agrégation, and the encounters with Jean-Pierre Vernon and Pierre Vidal-Naquet, who already were among the most brilliant scholars of ancient Greece in the world in those times. Well, the experience of travel enabled, I think, the young Normalien to transcend many physical, cultural, and mental boundaries. It engendered experiences of otherness and provided him, probably, with an anthropological perspective. On the other side, Hartog's encounters with Vernon and Vidal represented the crossing of another boundary. At that time, there was a great divide between the Grande École and the university itself, on the one hand, and the Centre Gernet a center for the comparative study of ancient societies, founded by Vernon in 1964. In the 1960s and 70s, this center was the most important, or at least one of the most important institutions in the world for the study of Greek civilization. I completely agree on this with Oswin Murray. One of the old masters of Greek history is still alive. But it's important to note here that the Journée Center combined classical studies and Durkheim's sociology, social history, and Meyerson historical psychology, and the history of religions with the history of mentalities, mythology, and ancient and modern philosophy. Vernon, a philosopher by training, if I remember well, he was awarded the first place in the Agrégation Nationale. Had been one of the military leaders of the French resistance. And he too crossed well-established borders, included disciplinary borders. And in the 70s, in the 1970s, he had already begun to cast a profoundly innovative eye on Greece. He truly was an atypical classical scholar. As for Vidal, yes, he knew his Plato, but he loved and practiced history à part entière, as the French say, and was close to the oppressed of every time and country. He pushed Hartog towards history and introduced him to Moses Finley, whom McCarthyism in USA had forced to leave the United States, and who was renewing ancient history from Cambridge by focusing on economics, politics, and the understanding of slavery. In the 1970s, Hartog was one of the young scholars from many different countries who were closely associated with Vernon and Vidal. His dissertation on Herodotus was written in those vibrant years and discussed in 1970. The dissertation committee was composed by Jean-Pierre Vernon, Pierre Vidal-Naquet, Michel de Certeau, François Dunant, and Giuseppe Nenci. Le Miroir d'Hérodote, that was published 1 year later, was a study of how Herodotus explored the ways in which the others could be seen by him as the opposite of the Greeks. The book, after having been appreciated and discussed by specialists in many fields of history for at least 2 decades, finally became fundamental to a new understanding of the significance of ethnic and cultural otherness in history. Memoir d'Ulysse was published many years later in 1996, but it was dedicated to another Greek traveler like Herodotus. Even more than the previous one, it was a book about crossing borders, both tangible and conceptual, between humans and gods, the living and the dead, civilization and wilderness, Greeks and barbarians, rationality and magic, antiquity and modernity. It was also a book about the relationship of travel and displacement to knowledge, and above all, about the impact of otherness on European identities. The Greeks return in other books, such as Ancien, Moderne, Sauvage, and Parti pour la Grèce, which both focus on our relationship to ancient Greece as a cultural artifact. not a mechanical heritage, or on the others, who force us to rethink the relationship between the ancients and the moderns. Hartog has since written extensively also on history from Homer to Augustine, on historical writing, on historical evidence and what historians see, and on faith in history, Croire en l'histoire, 2013. The connection with his major books on time is apparent. Just a few words now on Régime d'historicité, Regimes of Historicity, a book already mentioned in this morning's seminar. Its title refers to the manner in which a specific human community develops and represents an experience of time that relates past, present, and future, thereby shaping its self-consciousness. After discussing in depth in the terms of Koselleck's conceptual history, many experiences of time, from classical antiquity to the 20th century, Hartog notes that after the historical rupture of 1981, the gap, as Hannah Arendt would have it, we experience the end of any historicism. Now, the all-invasive presence of the present in our lives and minds leaves little room, or no room indeed, for either the past or the future. The present moment is, in a way, self-sufficient. With reference to this, we owe to Hartog the all-important notion of presentism. Indeed, the main feature of presentism is the vanishing of the future, and with it, of the idea of progress, which were the dominant categories of the modern regime of historicity after the French Revolution. The more recent book, Chronos, l'Occident aux prises avec le temps, qui a été, which has been translated in Italian, pays a particular attention to the origins of the modern concept of time, which Hartog sees as related in many ways to the Christian regime of historicity. According to him, modern notions of temporality and historicity were an integral part of theological political discourse, insofar as history was seen as projected toward the salvation or liberation of humanity. The crisis of this perspective is also necessarily, in a way, the crisis of temporality and historicity today. We are left with an omnipresent, cumbersome, deafening present that makes us experience the impossibility of relating ourselves to the past and the future. It's only an apparent paradox that this prevents us from understanding the present itself. In the end, and understandably, the human beings. Hartog's last major book, De partager l'humanité, humaine, humaniste, inhumaine, draws a very broad and thorough picture of the humanist tradition in modern Europe and raises crucial questions about the pairs of opposites that have marked the humanist tradition. But now even more burning questions arise. Are humans really so exceptional? And can the divide between human and animal life still be seen as absolutely stark? And what about human beings? and robots. Maybe our distinguished guest is willing to say something also about this. In any case, dear colleague, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And now, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for this extremely precise and generous introduction. The topic of my lecture is, as you mentioned at the end of your presentation, in relation to my last book. And the question is, what does that mean to be human? Is there something specific in the fact of being human or not? And as I am an historian, or some sort of an historian, the question becomes, how did human communities confront in different ways all along history that question? Today, for this lecture, I'll confine myself first to Greek anthropology alone, with the aim of following the logic of its development from its central question, mortality. Then I'll leap without transition from what I call this constitution of Anthropos, the title of the lecture, in a universe which, though long since bygone, Greek universe, has nonetheless left its mark on the rest of European history. So I will jump to its contemporary dissolution. If, at the risk of being caricatural, I leave aside all the intermediate stages, all the successive divisions between what is human only imperfectly so or not at all, I leave aside all the successive historical figures of human being. And of course, doing that, which is very schematic or very harmful, I'm not in no way at all suggesting that there was a teleology at work leading from this initial constitution of Anthropos to its dissolution. So first, the constitution of Anthropos. All men are mortal. Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. A famous syllogism, if ever there was one. In Greece, the recognition of this anthropological fact was thought out and institutionalized through a first great division. The inescapable death of human beings was answered by the immortality of other beings, as if recognizing one's own mortality could only be achieved by attributing immortality to other superior, distant, and not necessarily benevolent entities. The human condition is conceived from an initial paradox. Anthropos, man in the sense of the human race, is opposed to theos, the divine being. In fact, mortality is not conceived from immortality, which would be primary. We go from the mortal to the immortal. Immortals, as you know, are defined negatively, athanatoi. They are exempt and, as it were, deprived of death. The positivity of immortality can only be conceived in terms of its antonym, the brief and ever precarious life of mortals. Who or what are these radically other beings? Primitive powers emerging from the abyss, superior entities, such as the stars, but also supernatural forces. Gradually, divinities emerge with their distinctive features, genealogies, attributes, and eras of competence. They came to form pantheons, which end up constituting veritable, ever more ramified organigram of the divine. For Herodotus, it is understood that it was Homer and Hesiod who, quote, established a theogony for the Greeks, attributed to the god their qualifier, divided among them honors and skills, drew their figures. If gods and goddesses last forever and reside in the lofty mansions of Olympus, they have not always been there. In short, they have a genealogy. 2 points are worth noting. Immortal, the Greek gods are not eternal, but sempiternal. They have a birth, and once born, they last forever. In those early days, however, the boundary between divine beings and mortals was not absolute. But thus, from the day he becomes father of gods and men, imposes his order. He intends to forbid these transgressions. With a God eternal and creator of all things, one has to think out a new anthropology. And that will happen with Christianity. By detailing the establishment of the sovereignty of Zeus, from whom nothing escapes, Hesiod also explains the misfortunes of the human condition. This is the first important point. For by establishing the respective lots of gods and men, he puts into form and narrative an early Greek anthropology. The epic narrative becomes a learned theogony that is also an anthropogony and a theodicy, insofar as Hesiod justified world and social order from Zeus' point of view. As for humans, 2 passages, one in the Theogony, the other in Labors and Days, define their condition. The first, which brings Zeus face to face with Prometheus, also immortal, marks the separation of gods and men, dividing, and that's the invention of sacrifice, dividing the oaks unequally with the gods on one side and mortal on the other, means that the initial commensality with the gods is over. For the gods, it's the fat-covered bones. For human, it's the skin, flesh, and entrails. Clearly, the good lot, while the gods seem cheated. Hence, the anger of Zeus, who was in fact plotting, he said Hesiod, plotting the ruin of the mortals. He retaliates by depriving them of fire, In reply, Prometheus, ever benevolent, managed to steal the fire and return it to mankind. Thus, he's furious again, and, quote, instead of fire, he creates an evil destined for humans, that is, Pandora, the woman, a deep and dead end trap. This confrontation, where cunning and violence mingle, first confirmed Zeus' order. Then, as the story progresses, the condition of mortals becomes clearer. They must offer sacrifice to the god. To do so, they must practice animal husbandry. No wild animals are sacrificed, as well as agriculture, especially to feed women's insatiable bellies. It goes without saying that fire is needed to cook flesh and prepare bread. The unequal dividing of the oaks seems to favor humans at the expense of the gods, but in reality, the smoke of the sacrifice is enough for the gods, who feed on nectar and ambrosia, while mortals can only subsist on solid foods. Otherwise, they die. Lastly, although Pandora gave birth to the accursed race of women, she is nonetheless the necessary evil that through marriage ensures the succession of generations. Thanks to her, said Hesiod, parents do not grow old in misery and escape a lonely death. This is how Zeus, meditating on the ruin of mortals, completes it, starting with the unequal sharing of an ox. In labor and days, Hesiod again returned to the miseries of the human condition. A conflict with his brother over his father's inheritance leads Hesiod to recall how hard labor was imposed on mankind following the confrontation between Zeus and Prometheus. And even more than in the Theogony, Pandora is presented as the main cause of the misfortunes that have become the lot of mankind. A veritable fabrication of Hephaestus from earth and water, Pandora is also endowed with all feminine trappings and graces, not to mention a crafty art and deceptive words. Thus fashioned by all the gods, according to their respective attributes, she receives her name of Pandora, Doron meaning the gift, because, said Hesiod, because it is all the inhabitants of Olympus who, with this gift, make a present of misfortune to bread-eating men. From the outset, the woman lot is that of a necessary evil, by means of which the gods deceive mankind, taking revenge for Prometheus' deception. For Hesiod, what's important to reiterate is that there is, quote, no escape from the designs of Zeus. That is to say, a life of toil where inevitably the sorrows outweigh the joys. Placed between the beast and the gods, man raises and sacrifices the former in honor of the deities. A central practice, sacrifice, is a celebration that brings together all the meaning of the word dividing, separation from the god, separation from the animal, though not without a certain closeness. You don't sacrifice a wild animal. To sacrifice is to acknowledge that you are mortal, in need of nourishment. Though unequal, the dividing of the animal is also a form of sharing with the gods, who rejoice, who have joys in sacrifices in their honor. And finally, the shearing of the ox or the sheep or the goat is the occasion for a banquet, a sharing with commensals, relatives, or fellow citizens. A few words about what I call a Trojan horse. That is an immortal soul. After his condemnation, Socrates, speaking for the last time, maintains that there is no need to dread death. Either, he says, it's a deep sleep where all consciousness disappears, and what could be better than such a night, or it's a journey of the soul to Hades, where all the dead are met, and whom Socrates will then hasten to question. In any case, those over there are happier than those here, if only because they can no longer experience death. You don't die twice. This pleasant Hades is closer to the islands of the blessed than to the place populated by forgetful shadows visited by Odysseus. But the point to remember is that Socrates envisages a journey of the soul, psyche, and of a soul which, having left the body, retains all its faculties. Whether death is sleep or travel, death, Socrates concludes, must be seen as a good. With this alternative, Plato in fact presents two visions of death for the Greeks, the most common, according to which there is nothing after or beyond death, the other, in which the immortality, at least of the soul, emerges. This alternative opens up the immense and long debated problem of the soul. Let's limit ourselves to this only one remark. Inevitably, the recognition of an immortal soul calls into question all the division hitherto established by the first anthropology, starting with the now insurmountable frontier between mortality and immortality. Plato has remained the major architect of this reversal. So I stop here with the ancient world and go straight to 1970. But if you want to know what is in between, you can look at the book. Without further ado, and for the sole purpose of this lecture, let's move on to the 1970s. What was the intellectual conjuncture like, and in what terms did the question of being human arise? Juxtaposing these two moments, however far apart they may be, had the advantage of highlighting the contrast between them, casting a cross-light on both. During these years, Anthropos was called into question from a variety of quarters, with varying degrees of radicalism, from philosophy, anthropology, biology, neuroscience, paleontology, but also from feminist movement, more recently from ecofeminism, animalist movement, transhumanist, and finally from the aptly misnamed Anthropocene. Concomitant, yet partially independent, these multiple critics share a common recusal of something specific to human beings. In 1966, in the finale of Les mots et les choses, Michel Foucault diagnosed that, quote, man is perishing as the being of language shines more brightly on the horizon, end of quote. Ask 3 years later about this, death of man, which, says a journalist with whom he spoke, has aroused great emotion and innumerable controversies among our good humanists. And I think that the journalist is an Italian one. He replies, quote, there is no need to be particularly moved by the end of man. It's only the particular case, or if you like, one of the visible forms of a much more general demise. By this, I do not mean the death of God, but the death of the subject, of the capital subject with capital S, or the subject at the origin and foundation of knowledge, and all with capital knowledge, freedom, language, and history. And what about the so-called human sciences? Answer. I believe that the human sciences, that's Foucault speaking, I believe that the human sciences do not lead at all to the discovery of something that would be the human, the truth of man, his nature, his birth, his destiny. What the various human sciences are really concerned with is something quite different from man. They are what they are. They are systems, structures, combination, form, and so on. Consequently, if we wish to deal seriously with the human sciences, we must first and foremost destroy the obnoxious chimeras constituted by the idea that we must search for man. End of quote. Man is not the game of the human sciences, and what I call Homo humanus, the man of the humanist tradition, is nothing but a chimera. In fact, Foucault adds, quote, the idea of man worked in the 19th century in much the same way as the idea of God had worked in previous centuries. And yet, says Foucault, we were still terrified by the idea of a humanity that could continue to function without God. Hence, the conviction that the idea of God had to be maintained if humanity was to continue to function. Now you say to me, and I'm speaking to the journalist, now you say to me, perhaps it's necessary for the idea of humanity to exist, even it's only a myth for humanity to function. My answer is maybe, but maybe not. Neither more or less than the idea of God. So, end of quote. So the general idea is clear. Man, humanity, humanism are myths, and we are discovering that we can function. And it's interesting to see that in those years, Foucault was using quite frequently these notions, the word function, the verb, the notion of function. Without them, as far as anthropology is concerned, one of the great questions of the discipline has been the division between nature and culture. Now I move from Foucault to the nature-culture problem. Having in fact developed around this very division, it will first question it, then challenge it. Philippe Descola, the anthropologist, work is topical in this respect. Indeed, his questionnaire largely stems from the opposition between nature and culture. But the further he progressed, the more he was led to go beyond this dualism, to advocate, and that's his word, a fully monistic anthropology beyond nature and culture. Getting rid of all dualism is in fact a major feature of the current situation. Beyond nature and culture, that the book in which he sets out this path and proposes nothing less than a new departure for anthropology, was born, he says, out of a feeling of dissatisfaction with the way in which the relationship between nature and society was handled. A first effort at clarification consisted in demonstrating that, quote, the opposition between nature and culture does not possess the universality that is attributed to it, because it is devoid of meaning for anyone other than moderns. Once freed of this ethnocentric presupposition, the anthropologist is in a position to hear for what they are other cosmologies which, quote, confer on animals and plants most of the attributes of humanity. Indeed, many so-called primitive societies, he writes, invite us to go beyond the division we have established between humans and non-humans, who have never thought that the boundaries of humanity stopped at the gate of the human species, who do not hesitate to invite the most modest, and I'm quoting Descola, who do not hesitate to invite the most modest of plants, the most insignificant of animals, into the concert of their social life. Anthropology, therefore, faces a formidable challenge, either to disappear with an exhausted form of humanism, or to metamorphose by rethinking its field and its tools in such a way as to include in its object much more than just anthropos, the entire collectivity of existing being linked to it and now relegated to the function of entourage. For Descola, there are in fact four ways of grouping the existing, whether human or non-human, referring to what he calls four ontologies: naturalism, specific to the West according to him, animism, totemism, and analogism. Leaving aside the last two, I'll confine myself to a very brief evocation of naturalism and animism. Naturalism, as defined by Descola, has increasingly separated humans and non-humans. Faced with this treatment of what exists, animism occupies an antithetical position. Indeed, it can be defined like this, quote, the imputation by humans to non-humans of an interiority identical to their own. This disposition humanizes plants and especially animals, since the soul they are endowed with enables them not only to behave according to the social norms and ethical precepts of humans, but also to establish communicative relationships with the latter and with each other. The similarity of their inner selves thus authorizes an extension of the state of culture to non-human. However, this humanization is not complete, for in animistic systems, those kinds of disguised humans that are plants and animals are distinguished from humans precisely by their clothings of feathers, hair, scales, or bark. In other words, by their physicality. End of quote. From this very rapid comparison of naturalistic and animistic ontologies, we can see that naturalistic ontology gives man a special status, while animistic ontology does not. Does this mean that the human has disappeared? No, on the contrary, it seems to me, it extends it. Since plants and animals share the same interiority as humans, the same soul. What does it mean exactly by soul? I don't know, but in any case, animism can be said to be anthropogenic insofar as it brings about from humans all that is necessary for non-humans to be treated as humans. So animism is anthropogenic and naturalism is anthropocentric. When all is said and done, naturalism appears for what it is, one of the four ontologies, one of the ways of putting existing things in order, but whose claims to be the standard for the other three, or for the other three, are unfounded. The dualism that runs through its long history up to the nature-culture divide, on which ethnology has settled, has made modern science possible, which is no mean feat, but it has also inscribed a boundary between humans and non-humans, leading to, quote, of the scholar, to a regime of apartheid. With now a few words about the question of the exceptionalism of human being. With structural man, we gave everything to culture and nothing to nature. That was noticed by Jean-Pierre Changeux in his book Neuronal Man, published in 1983. And for him, the opposite is true. He is fully man is fully and uniquely natural, so much so that the animal human body, soul, or spirit, brain spirit divisions are no longer relevant. Quote, in terms of both the macroscopic anatomy of the cortex, of the brain, and its microscopic architecture, there is no sudden qualitative reorganization from animal to human brain. On the contrary, there is, I told quote continuing, there is a quantitative and continuous evolution of the total number of neurons, and therefore of the complexity of the neural networks that make up the cerebral machine. That was, I don't know what he would say today. Philosopher Francis Wolff, perhaps you know him, draws a general remark from Changeux's observations. Under these conditions, he writes, there is no longer an other of man. Structural man had broken with God, the great other. There was no upward boundary. Neuronal man breaks with the little other, if you like, the animal. There are no more downward boundaries. Under the empire of the biological, man can no longer be defined in opposition to all other living beings. Neuronal man is one because he is a living being. But because he is a living being, he is no longer properly human. This is the effect of the substitution of the methodological monism of the natural sciences for the methodical dualism of structural man. From the perspective of evolutionary biology, man, when I say man, it's always a human being, of course. Man not only has a biological part, he is a biological being, and that is his identity. As a result, hominization must be seen as the result of historical sequences in the evolution of living things, with no finalism at work. Paleontology has shown that there is no one humanity, but many humanities. The vision of Homo sapiens as the ultimate fruit of the hominization process is no longer tenable. Homo sapiens may be the most recent human species, but it has coexisted with other human species for thousands of years. Going back to our ancestors makes it problematic to draw a line between man and non-man. From this biologization of the human question, it follows not that social and cultural facts are epiphenomenon grafted on a biological nature, but that there are intrinsic aspects of human biological identity. Thus, historical and therefore social and cultural time is a specific form of humanity's biological time. Culture does not transcend the biology of man, but is one of its major features. Beyond false opposition, and in particular, the most flawed of them all, that between nature and culture. Now a word about the augmented man. By actively promoting an augmented human being, transhumanists are working to lower or even eliminate the boundary not between animal and man, but between man and machine. Contrary to the teaching of evolutionary biology, they remain dualists. There is the brain and there is the body. In an increasingly near future, as the philosopher Jean-Michel Beignet sums up, techno-scientific progress will enable us to escape the physical constraints characteristic of the human condition. How will we live without being born, since we will be able to result from a technical production, without suffering or falling ill, since nanomedicine will prevent us from doing so, and finally, without dying, since we'll be able, for example, to download the content of our consciousness onto some inalterable material that can be implemented on demand in some substitute body. Our transformation into cyborgs, contraction of cybernetic organism, will then be nearing completion. The best-known prophet of the coming disruption, Ray Kurzweil, predicts the arrival of what he called the singularity in 2045, when, I quote, we will be able to multiply our actual intelligence by a billion by merging it with the artificial intelligence we have created. End of quote. Thanks to the ever-accelerating development of artificial intelligence, combined with advances in nanotechnology, biotechnology, and cognitive science, the union of the technical and the biological will produce an hybrid being. Will we still need to speak of an augmented man, or will it be a man-machine in the sense of a humanized machine? Nick Bostrom, director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, while aware of the existential risk that artificial intelligence can pose, is convinced of the considerable benefits it can bring. Not surprisingly, the elimination of poverty, disease, aging, and death, the downloading of our minds into computer, and so on. Sam Altman, Silicon Valley's new phoenix, says it all on his world tour promoting ChatGPT. Things are moving so fast that Elon Musk and his company Neuralink have obtained permission to test their brain implants on humans, enabling them to control computer by thought. These technological advances are cause for concern. In a book published in 2023, an American philosopher and jurist, Nita Farahany, perhaps you have heard of her book, or urged legislators to concern themselves with the defense of what she called cognitive freedom, a dimension of personal liberty now threatened by possible malicious intrusions into the brain. The ingenuity, as we know, of hackers is always one step ahead. With the prospect of augmented man, the one receiving the most media attention, could come at last the transformation and abolition of the oldest division, men are mortal, from which we started. But where the Greeks set up a three-term scheme, immortals, beasts, men, transhumanists think they can get away with a single term, namely a technological reformulation of the mantra, man is a god for man. In the form, there is no other god that augmented man, and it's within our reach. Better still, it's already here. Other living beings, whether animals or plants, do not hold their attention. Anthropocentric, if not exclusive, transhumanists will save themselves, provided they can get enough electrical power for long enough. If human beings are no longer mortal, do they have access to immortality? No. Having entered the afterlife of the singularity, in a new space-time, their lot would be, I think, rather some kind of mortality, more or less indexed to the possibilities of successive uploading from one machine to another. With their mortality would come not anti-humanism or inhumanism, but something like digital humanism. Now, very briefly, word about feminism. The association, and I'll follow only one thread, the one of nature and culture, because of the very long associations of women with nature. And will be mention only the book of an historian of science and feminist, Caroline Merchant. Perhaps you know, probably you know her. Caroline Merchant, the book, The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution, published in 1980, in which she studied in a tipping point in this long history. Her book was widely acclaimed for three reasons, as she explained in a new preface. It was one of the first critics of the problem of modernism and in particular of mechanistic science and the worldview associated with it, which gave rise to the postmodern deconstruction of enlightenment, optimism, and progress. Secondly, as ecofeminism came to the fore during the 1980s and 1990s, the book was seen as an avant-garde statement of the relationship between women and nature. Thirdly, it paved the way for a reassessment of the ethical relationship between humans and nature, moving away from ideas of domination and towards a dynamic new partnership between people and their environment. The period under consideration in her book was between the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Renaissance organic vision of the cosmos, in which all elements were related to one another, was replaced by a mechanistic representation in which nature is reconceptualized as dead and passive, to be dominated and controlled by humans. Remaining bound to nature, women that find themselves doubly inferior. They are on the side of this passive nature to be dominated, but they are also on the side of that wild part of nature that escapes control. It's the witch, a lust, a diabolical Sabbath that must be hunted down and burned at the stake. And so it was. In other words, the accentuation of the distinction between nature and culture was to the detriment of women. Yet, for the ecofeminists of the 1880s, 1990s, the domination of nature and that of women are in fact two intersecting dominations that refer to each other. Caroline Merchant's books provide a major reference point for understanding how the two are intertwined when we move from an organistic vision of the universe to a mechanistic vision of the universe and suggest way out. Since the deepening of the dichotomy between nature and culture has been a factor in the construction of modern Europe, and thus also in the subordination or naturalization of women, its recusal must enable women to break free from this assignment. The rejection of this long-standing dualism, while in line with that of the life sciences, paleontology, anthropology, does not mean that ecofeminists wish to abandon all reference to nature. Indeed, at the end of her book, Merchant suggests that a reassessment of the constraints and value historically associated with the organic worldview may be essential for a viable future. Which ones? Those, quote, of cyclical processes, the interconnectedness of all things, and the assumption that nature is active and alive. What's more, organicism, which preceded mechanism in Europe, was widespread in societies on other continents and has remained so to this day. This is why ecofeminists, attentive to women's struggles around the world, have put forward proposal for reclaiming, quote, the positive relationship between women and nature without returning to some kind of eternal femininity. Donna Haraway, probably you know her. Donna Haraway polymorphous work is another example of this refusal to accept the division between nature and culture, and more broadly, the dualism that have accompanied the circumscriptions of humans' or own nature. Distrustful of theories, which are always simplistic, she seeks to create and tell new stories that privilege what she calls improbable and significant encounters between all these critters, as she called them, humans and non-humans. Gone are the days of the viriloid, both of the viriloid history of man and history. What we need today are geo-histories. With a taste for etymologies to draw out the effects of meaning, she brings human closer to humus, the earth in Latin. But that's something the Romans were not unaware of, but nevertheless. But without stopping there, she draws all the consequences. If this is so, why not prefer compost, more evocative than humus? Why not prefer compost to posthumans and posthumanism? Or why not prefer humusities to humanities? Which is a play on the word. Humans are as humus, may well have a future if only, and that's a quote, we can chop up humans as homo, the winning project of a self-made human manager of a planet demolishing enterprise, end of quote. Under these conditions, to call the Anthropocene an era in which man, anthropos, is stripped of all exceptionality seems highly inappropriate, since neither the human species nor man and tool make history. And she said, Terra's inhabitants invent way of living and dying that are interwoven, intertwined, and tentacular, but they don't make history. Similarly, again, the transhumanist and posthumanist claim to an autopoiesis of the human being. She argues for sympoiesis. It's not true that mortal worlds, by whatever name they are called, happen on their own. There are always partners involved. In the beginning, she would say, was not dividing, but interaction. A significantly titled book, Staying with the Trouble, or better still, Inhabiting the Trouble, is dedicated to the makers of mismatch kinships. In all cases, the obsolete dividing line between nature and culture is erased, while hybridity is valorized. Acknowledging that the times in which we live are troubled and troubling, and proposing not to emerge from troubles but to inhabit it, also means opting for a relationship with time that privileges the present. Inhabiting disorder means inhabiting the present and only the present, by making it habitable, precisely so that a livable future for all living beings is possible. Rejecting futurism, positive or negative, the proposal is, quote, to sicken the present, to enrich it with all the connections, all the active reciprocity that makes it a living density. So Donna Haraway, while not doubting the devastating effect of human activity on the earth, intends to use the term Anthropocene sparingly. In fact, to do so would be to do too much honor to this anthropos, which she would like to chop up. Indeed, it's inappropriate for him to give his name to this new epoch, which, she believes, should more appropriately be called the Capitalocene, because it's not Anthropos who is in charge of this damned hydraulic fracturing. Rather, we need to see, and above all experience, the epoch as the twilight of this Anthropos, which leaves behind him a world in ruins, and as the possible opening of a common world bringing together humans and non-human, transcending masculine and feminine, and cultivating interrelations and hybridization. According to the new division proposed by the late Bruno Latour, humans are though still living in the Holocene era and clinging to what he called the old climate regime, while Earthlings, human and non-human combined, are of the Anthropocene and have taken note of the new climate regime. Inevitable, then, is a conflict between humans living in the Holocene epoch and Earthling of the Anthropocene. From this brief sequence in which feminism, ecofeminism, climate crisis meet, it's clear that if there is an Anthropocene, it means in fact the end of the human or man with capital letter, the disintegration of, what Latour says also, the ci-devant humans. Latour is fond of analogies with the French Revolution. For the anthropologist, the Brazilian anthropologist, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, such a world without man would in fact come to meet the all-in-person world made entirely of subjects of Amerindian cosmogonies, for which there is not, on the one hand, humanity, and on the other, the world, on the one hand, culture, and on the other, nature, but a real consubstantiality of the two. Having followed very different paths, the world after man and the world of animism, not before man, but where, on the contrary, everything was originally human, would thus come to correspond. The latter, if not propose itself as a model, at least be seriously meditated upon by the former as a form, or some kind of revenge of the vanquished. The anthropos of the Anthropocene, conclude Bruno Latour, not hesitating to mobilize the Bible this time. So the anthropos of the Anthropocene is Babel after the fall of the giant tower. At last, human beings can no longer be unified, he says. At last, he is no longer off the ground. At last, he is no longer outside earthly history. Thus, we have gone too fast, but it was already long, from the circumscription of Anthropos in the Greek universe through a series of divisions to its dissolution through the questioning of these very divisions and the rejection of all the dualisms that had hitherto served to conceive of the order of the world and human's proper nature. Thank you.
Thank you for this inspiring and insightful lecture. I think that there will be many questions and comments. Now I will leave the floor to Irene Zavater that will discuss this lecture and stimulate the discussion.
Je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre conférence qui a été très intéressante et qui nous a montré aussi, nous a donné un exemple magnifique du métier de l'historien. Et ça, était déjà sorti des présentations que mes collègues vous avaient adressées, mais encore plus à partir de votre exposé, nous avons saisi que le métier de l'historien, c'est celui de démontrer que les catégories que nous utilisons, dans ce cas celui de humain, mais aussi de nature, de droit, ne sont ni universelles ni naturelles, mais bien des constructions historiques. Et les travaux que vous avez conduits et aussi ce soir dans votre conférence montre une sorte de généalogie des mots et des concepts. De cette façon, reconstituer la genèse, les transformations, les usages des catégories à travers les différentes époques. Je pense que c'est une histoire que aussi dans notre département, nous essayons de pratiquer. Nous avons des séminaires d'histoire des concepts politiques, gérés notamment par M. Nicoletti et Mme Faitini. Et donc, l'histoire des concepts, ça donne en effet une vision de l'histoire, et nous sommes des historiens de la pensée, bien sûr, pas des historiens tout court. Ça donne une idée de l'histoire différente qui change. Ce qui m'a frappé ce soir, vu que j'ai eu l'occasion de commencer à lire votre dernier livre, de partager l'humanité, le fait que vous avez choisi de partir des Grecs et d'insister à la fin sur l'écoféminisme, là aussi c'est une question que nous avons abordée pendant pas mal de séminaires dédiés à la pensée des femmes. Et donc, cela m'a frappé beaucoup. Et j'avais lu le chapitre que vous aviez dédié à Caroline Merchant et Donna Haraway. Et je pense que cette dernière, c'est une historienne de la science, n'est-ce pas? Les considérations que vous faites à propos d'elle, que vous venez d'exprimer, je pense que tient ensemble deux choses deux aspects que pour vous sont importants, si j'ai bien compris votre travail. C'est-à-dire que le fait que Haraway n'accepte pas le dualisme entre culture et nature, et aussi le fait qu'elle souhaite de vivre dans le présent, c'est un exemple de présentiste, n'est-ce pas? Et donc, c'est un exemple du fait que l'anthropos, disons la vision de l'humanisme classique, s'est détruit, par exemple, dans les œuvres de cette penseuse. Ce que je voulais vous demander, c'est est-ce que après l'exposition que vous avez fait et aussi le parcours que vous faites dans votre livre, vous avez une proposition à nous donner? C'est-à-dire, il s'agit de post-humanisme et est-ce que, vu que nous vivons dans un moment où l'homme n'est plus le centre du monde, mais un acteur parmi d'autres dans un écosystème complexe. Est-ce que le passage d'un humanisme classique à une pensée post-humaniste implique nécessairement un abandon complet de l'idée d'humanité?
Okay. Well, je peux vous répondre en français. Non, mais peut-être c'est pas. It's not appropriate for the audience. En tout cas, merci de m'avoir posé la question en français. No, I don't like all these words, this post-humanism, post-history, far away now, postmodern, because they are in a way presentist. You are no, and I don't think that the question of post-humanity. The question is how to think some concept of humanity in this different world. but not to. It's not necessary to say that we move to something which is post. That's not the same, or to say post-humanism. What is post-humanism? It's no. I think it would be something. Some questions that some work would be to try to see what might be the meaning of a humanism in a world where humans are no longer no longer occupy center stage. But that does not imply that you have to reflect in terms of post. So I don't. If you look at humanism, you had several humanism along from the Romans up today, and humanism was conceived as some concept in between human on one side and inhuman on the other side, or barbarian, or what. Okay, so that was at least the project. And if I look at the Roman world, their main question was not what does that mean to be anthropos? I mean, they agree with the Greeks with the division, mortal, immortal, and the sacrifice and all that sort of things. But the thing which interests them much or more was what does that mean to be an homo humanus? And that because for them, every human being belonged to the category of homo, even a slave, but he was certainly not an homo humanus, and was not supposed to be, never to attain this condition of homo humanus. So that's how to, and this quality of homo humanus, you have to work to get it. And you have all this vocabulary about precisely culture. You have as the vocabulary of the agriculture. And that when you, and this quality of homo humanus is not forever. You can lose it. I mean, you can fall down into barbarism. And I could say the same things at different moments. So there is no reason to say no, it's over. We have to think of post-humanism. No, we have to think of let's say a new humanism, or a new acception of what might be the meaning of humanism, as soon as as I said, human beings are no longer at the center of the stage, and that does not imply that they disappear totally, or you have to say no, human no longer. I mean, it's this position is occupied, for example, by certain animalists. And if you read this, the most known animalist, Peter Singer, you have no more place for this terrible being with the human one. But you can pay attention to the animal condition, but you are not obliged to suppress a human being if you do that. So, well,
Any other question? Right. Yes, we have a question.
Just a simple and quite generic one, but what do you think about the thought of Teilhard de Chardin? So something similar to the Anthropocene and the evolution in the noosphere, something like a collective consciousness. Could it have been realized something similar to what you would say in the past just 70 or 80 years ago? Now, the noosphere as something similar to the evolution that the Anthropocene could have. What do you think about this thought? Just that.
yes, Teilhard de Chardin, I'm not familiar with the thought of Teilhard de Chardin, but it is at the same time a work in paleontology, and he's a Jesuit, and he proposed this vision, some kind of eschatological vision of this constitution of what he called this noosphere, and I don't know exactly how to deal with this kind of proposal, but partly because I don't know enough, and partly because it seems to me that it's perhaps it's not fair to say that, but he's trying to propose some reformulation of the eschatological vision of the Christianity, in putting into scientific or kind of scientific terms. But
Any other, please, Federico Laudisa.
First of all, thank you for your really stimulating talk. I have a couple of points very briefly. The first is that I was a little puzzled by something that you said about naturalism, but maybe I misunderstood. But if I understood well, it seems that you suggest that in a naturalist outlook, there is a kind of uniqueness claim for man with respect to human with respect to non-human, whereas it seems to me that it should be the contrary. This is my first point.
just I use naturalism in the sense Descola is using it, and it's peculiar. It's
I
not
see.
the ordinary meaning of the
Okay.
what you apply.
So I got it right. Okay, thanks. The second point concerns kind of analysis that you were referring about the merchant viewpoint. I have the feeling that sometimes in that kind of analysis, there is a very naive view of science when certain kind of sciences is considered to be mechanistic, and this is the reason or the motivation for a process that leads to man control over nature and so on. And often I think that this kind of naive analysis do more harm than good to the evaluation of the role of science in human culture. So I mean, probably science has never been mechanistic in that sense, even in the 17th century. So I have some problems with that. Thanks. If you have an opinion on this.
Oh, I have an opinion, but I'm not able to evaluate it in terms of scientific knowledge, of evaluated of the proposal made by Caroline Merchant, that I refer to her because she appeared as being a prominent figure in that history, and she is recognized as a historian of science. Okay, that does not mean that she is right necessarily, but she has a credential for that. Okay, but the interesting thing, you are certain, I'm sure you are right. You don't move from the world of the 16th century, where you have everything in correspondence with everything, the Pico della Mirandola, and a mechanistic world where men take the power. But she's using the example, and she puts a great emphasis on that in medicine. The fact that until 17th century, women were s'occuper des accouchements. Come... In italiano, sì, va bene. Come?
Ostetrica. Oui,
et les sages-femmes, comme on dit.
Oui, les sages-femmes, c'est ça, levatrici.
Okay. So that was the responsibility of the women in the hand. They were in charge of that. And men arrived, and they doctors, and they replaced the women, saying, no, that's not your job, because we have the knowledge to do that. And the accouchement became a medical thing with the exclusiveness of doctor doing that. So that's, for her, that's an important element of our demonstration.
Yes, Nicolette.
Thank you so much. My question is related to the relationship between humanity and mortality, because
And mortality.
mortality. I was quite impressed by this importance and influence of the issue and theme mortality in your talk, but also this morning in your conversation. You started with this distinction between immortal and mortal beings, and then during your speech you talk about the death of God, the death of man, the death of nature, our mortality, and so on. So my question is, in your interpretation, do you really think that for the self-understanding of the human being, the question of death is crucial, is more important than the question of rationality or freedom or benevolence, the typical features of the human being in the Western self-understanding of humanity?
I would say yes.
Okay.
But I would say yes, and I try to present this point of view, starting with the Greeks. And I think that all the Greek anthropology start from this fact and how to deal with that. And they built all their anthropology around that fact. And the Hesiod put it in a great narrative. And if you, I didn't speak of the Christians, but when you have an immortal, an eternal God, creator of everything, you have to rethink totally what does that mean to be human. And we spoke briefly this morning about the fact that in the Genesis, Adam and Eve was not supposed to be to be mortal, not immortal, but not to be mortal. And after that came the fall and death. But the main part, the main point is that human beings remain mortal, but the question, and it goes with the invention, so to speak, of the soul, we are mortals, but is there a possibility of an access to eternity? Not immortality, but to eternity. And the Christians answer yes. And that's a whole, because of Christ and so on and so on. So that's the center. And I could go on.
Yeah. Thank you.
So please, another question over there.
Si.
So I have a question regarding your concept of Homo inhumanus.
Of?
Homo
Inhumanus,
yes.
Inhumanus, yeah.
Yes. And I wanted to ask you, what was the reason of this humanity? And if you think that was related to the wars during the 20th century, or if there was present before like a seed of this inhumanity in the human nature. That's it. Thank you.
Well, so you are alluding to something I did not deal with tonight. A question of inhumanity. And I decide to focus on the interrogation on inhumanity on the 20th century. And of course, it's obvious that humanity exists from the very beginning of the emergence of human beings, but with under different justification or different manifestations. But I focus on the 20th century because, and especially the period between 1914 and 1945, because that's the moment where humanity was prominent. I mean, the great accomplishment of humanity were not practiced. Humanity was not practiced on this scale before, and of course the summum was with the Gulag in Russia, and with the extermination camp during the Nazi period. And my question was not to bring anything new on the behavior of the perpetrators, of course, because we know we have plenty of documents, testimonies, and so on. But the question rather, is it possible to stay human in a inhuman moment, facing inhumanity? And that's the question which was at the center of the three authors I decided to put in the forefront. That is with Primo Levi, with Shalamov, and Vasily Grossman. And they had, all of them have this question. And also the fact that the perpetrator, as if you appear as resisting, not even by, if you remain without saying a word, I mean, if you simply stay there, the perpetrators is in the process of losing his own humanity. So that's just this point I pay attention to.
Any other question? So if not, I will ask you will take advantage of this to ask you about your opinion about this prophecy about 2048. So do you think we are really heading toward a society of hybrid beings? So we are
The society of
hybrid beings, or so we are our nature and our identity of you as humans is changing, or is this a fear of change, a fear of new technology, which is what's your opinion?
No, I'm in terms of technology, I know nothing. So difficult for me to have an opinion with a minimum of ground, of substance. But I think that we have to be aware of the potential danger, or even more than that, precisely because in a presentist world, all the things I have mentioned briefly are forgotten, and so you can say, okay, that all these old things are obsolete and we have to forget them. And anyway, in any humanism has led to catastrophes, to massacres, to even to genocide. So it's time to leave all this stuff behind us. But you can also take into consideration the fact that during millennials, human beings have elaborated in knowledge, many books, reflections, trying to cope with what was at stake when they were there, when they were alive, and try to give answer and to organize their knowledge, and I think that we have a responsibility in not in preserving it as some kind of memorial, but to try to think also with all these constructions they made. Of course, we are not going to reactivate them as they were, but if we stay simply with the social media and in artificial intelligence and we are not well equipped to think simply, and I think that something I try to do.
So, well, if there are no further questions, I think that we can thank again Francois Hartog for this beautiful lecture. And next lecture will be next week with Adriana Cavarero. Okay. Thank you.
Grazie
you
a
all.
lei.
Grazie.